Eventually, there will be some kind of peace deal. It's just a question of, will that take 6 more days, 6 more weeks, 6 more months, or even potentially years? Because this is the kind of conflict that countries stumble into. They don't plan for a long-term war, but that could happen.
We're on the eve of a potentially major escalation in the war between Iran and the U.S., and everyone is just waiting with bated breath to see what the U.S. plans to do next, what its vision for this conflict is, what its strategy is. And so the President of the United States makes an announcement. He's going to give a big Thursday night speech. People are wondering what he's going to announce. Is it going to be more information about where the United States is headed in the Middle East? Is he going to start a new bombing campaign? Has there been a big breakthrough in the peace talks? But no, the speech isn't about the Iran war. It's not about the major U.S. conflict that it is involved in and that could potentially escalate and derail the global economy. It was all about his cockamamie theory that the 2020 elections were rigged.
As the documents we are releasing show, CIA reporting explicitly stated, and I quote, in mid-2018, the Chinese Communist Party's policy was to leverage all domestic and foreign elements that were opposed to the U.S. president in an effort to reduce the U.S. president's votes and make him resign or prevent his re-election. Isn't that nice?
Just spewing a bunch of nonsense, discredited information that even his own intelligence agencies have basically said is not true about his gripe that Joe Biden stole the election from him. Just more garbage. And there was not even in this particular case any real new information. The people who went through the file that he dumped, the documents in that file dump, they couldn't find anything substantive or new, just more of the same. It just shows that the president is fundamentally an unserious person and that he is not even temperamentally equipped to lead a conflict such as the one that the U.S. is heading into right now with Iran, this major re-escalation of the conflict. I'm Borzou Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at Borzou, BRZOU.substack.com or on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and you can also watch on YouTube. I would love for more YouTube followers. So if you get a chance, if you get a moment, get on YouTube. Look for my podcast, look for my link there, Badlands newsletter, or you can find the link on the newsletter page in the show notes in the Substack. There have been lots of developments in the conflict as we head into this weekend. This was going to be the second weekend in which we're back at war. There have been numerous U.S. airstrikes, all of them in southern Iran, focused on the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf area. They've prompted counterstrikes by Iranians at alleged American targets in Jordan, in the United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain, in Kuwait especially, and also in other parts of the Gulf. No major strikes yet by the Iranians on Saudi Arabia, however. And I think that is pretty interesting. It shows that there is still some understanding with some of the Gulf states. However, there was a warning from one of the Revolutionary Guard members earlier this week, not sure when it was recorded, in which he said if the war gets serious against Iran, that even those brotherly nations that are hosting U.S. bases or U.S. infrastructure will be targets. The relaunch of the war has prompted a lot of condemnations here in the U.S. Many Democrats are responding to the conflict with very vehement opposition, and they've been commenting publicly in contrast to the first start of the war when there was a rather tepid response from the Democrats. This time it seems they're coming out swinging. Here's New Jersey's Cory Booker.
How could we be complicit in this unjust war that has no clear objectives and that nobody can articulate a strategy to achieve any objective or get us out?
Here's Hawaii's Brian Schatz.
Donald Trump is dragging us back into war again, and no one is exactly sure why.
And here's New Hampshire's Jean Sheehan, who is stepping down and not running for re-election again this year.
Well, it's not just Democrats who want this war to end. It's the American people overwhelmingly think that we should not be in a war with Iran.
Now, all of these senators are loyal pro-Israel politicians who've received hundreds of thousands of dollars, perhaps even millions, from the Israel lobby in the United States. But they find themselves in a party that's vehemently opposed to Israel, which was strongly in support of the war and was even the impetus for the idea to launch the war earlier this year. I wonder if these guys are bending over backwards a bit to appease their constituents by opposing the Iran war, which is even more unpopular among Democratic voters than is. But in contrast to what these Democrats were saying, I actually am starting to believe that there is an important difference between this phase of the war and the previous one. What this phase of the war seems to have that the previous phase didn't was an actual goal. And that goal is the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. And if you look at the targeting, as I said earlier, it's focused almost exclusively on military sites and other infrastructure in southern Iran, even in southwestern Iran, where Kharg Island is located. That is Iran's main oil terminal. And there's lots of speculation in the media that the United States might be trying to make an attempt to take Kharg Island. This will be really bloody. Any attempt by the Americans to take Iranian territory will be met with extreme violence by the Iranians. Even if they're able to do it, even if they were able to hold on to that territory, it will be rather costly for the Americans, both in terms of materials and equipment, but more importantly, in terms of American lives. I don't think that they have fully thought out the plan here, if that is the plan, because just targeting the southern sites is not enough. What is also kind of interesting, and it could be working in the Americans' favor, is that there does seem to be a divergence between the views that are trickling out from southern Iran and those from the capital. There's a lot of bluster from Tehran and from Iranian officials, Iranian military officials, whereas, again, and this is a key thing, southern Iran is bearing the brunt of the war. And this harkens back to the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq war, where it was actually those southern cities, Ahvaz, Abadan, these southern areas that really felt the brunt of the Iraqi invasion and the Iraqi offensives, whereas those in other parts of the country weren't as affected by the war. Yes, there was airstrikes on Tehran, there was rocket attacks from the Iraqis during that war, but it was really the trauma of that war was really inflicted on parts of southwestern Iran and southern Iran as well, along the Gulf, where you had the tanker wars in the 80s, 1980s war. That was also a big burden on the southern Iranian portion of the country. And that's kind of an interesting thing. That is introducing a new dimension to the domestic politics of all this. I see a little bit of criticism coming from voices from the south of Iran saying, hey, you guys up there in Tehran talking tough, we're the ones who are having our bridges bombed. So I think that's kind of interesting that that's happening, and that merits more exploration. The Americans also need to sharpen their goals and make their case to the American public. Do I think that the Americans want to actually take control of southern Iran? No, I don't think they do. They just want to improve their bargaining position and get a deal that makes Trump and America look good and it makes them look like they won the war. I think they want to get back into the situation where they're fighting and negotiating at the same time so that they can maybe do more market manipulation, maybe be able to point to negotiations when it's expedient and then point to the war effort when it's expedient. And so I think that's ultimately the goal. I don't think it's at this point a war of imperial conquest anymore. The Americans are fighting a war to get back to the status quo ante, to get back to the situation that was before, which in a way, if you look at it, that is just a complete disaster. I mean, that may not be how the Trump administration is looking at it, but it's a real disaster. It's like get back to where you once belonged. And that's where the Strait of Hormuz was open and Iran was not actively bombing ships that are crossing the Strait of Hormuz or in the Persian Gulf. And things were a little bit more calm. And Donald Trump could just issue a lot of blather and bluster about Iran without actually doing anything about it. And what you see in the United States, instead of an articulate point of view, even if the military might have a plan at this point that it's already approved and they could be going forward with it because the U.S. military is rather meticulous, What's evident right now is that the U.S. is basically unraveling. The Trump administration is unraveling as a result of this war. And there's a certain desperation in the administration's messaging. There are reports that the U.S. strategic reserves are dwindling and that there will be an oil shock if something is not done quickly. Daily ship crossings in the Strait of Hormuz are just dropping to a new low and oil prices have reached a 1-month high. When you listen to administration officials, you can see the desperation, how alone and isolated the U.S. feels on this whole Iran issue, which it created itself. Here's Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
And I think it's a real test for the UN, right? As a function, as something that functions that can solve global problems. What is the purpose of the UN? The UN was supposed to be a place where you could peacefully resolve global conflict. Right now, you have a country who is unlawfully, criminally, and illegally taking possession of an international waterway and blowing up commercial vessels and putting mines in the water. I don't know if people appreciate how outrageous this is, how unacceptable it is that any country would fire and try to sink commercial vessels or put mines in the water. Both of these things are illegal. And so we're going to take it to the UN, and we're going to
I think it's just a little bit crazy for Marco Rubio to speak about international law or even the law of the seas after the government of the United States kidnapped the head of the internationally recognized Venezuelan government, massacred a whole bunch of poor fishermen who were just kind of out in the Caribbean Sea or off the coast of Venezuela on the Pacific side. It killed a bunch of school children in Iran on the first day of the war, and it didn't account for that, and it's refusing to accept any kind of responsibility for that. That's not mentioning the blockade of Cuba that Marco Rubio himself is essentially pushing. And let's not forget also that Marco Rubio, as he talks about international law, he's the guy who's personally launched this attack against the International Criminal Court this week. It's one of the few institutions around the world that actually holds war criminals like him and other world leaders, other genocidaires, holds them accountable. And he's launching a war against it. So I think it's perhaps a little bit hypocritical for him to talk about international law and the law of the seas and to express this frustration that the world isn't doing more about the Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz when the U.S. has basically taken international law, ripped it up, and flushed it down the toilet. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio's rival in the Trump administration is J.D. Vance, and he also made waves this week by confirming in an interview with Joe Rogan that Jeffrey Epstein was a spy. This is something that the New York Times refuses to acknowledge. Many major news outlets refuse to acknowledge that he had high-level contacts, that he was involved with intelligence operations, not just with the Mossad, but with the CIA as well. And he just kind of blurts it out and says this. And I'm hoping that now that he has done this, he will cause the New York Times and other news organizations, other mainstream news outlets to just acknowledge that Jeffrey Epstein had some really weird ties to international espionage and international espionage services, something that they've been ignoring for a long time. I've written about this on Badlands way back when, some months ago when the newsletter first started, when the podcast and newsletter were starting out. And if you want to go check that out, I'll put a link in the show description so you can read that article.
Clearly had connections to the highest levels of American intelligence. He clearly had connections to the highest levels of Israeli intelligence.
J.D. Vance also sparked thousands of accusations of anti-Semitism against him just for noting a Time magazine article that listed all of the right-wing influencers who are on the payroll of Israel.
There was a Time story that came out yesterday that basically there are certain influencers in America who are being paid in order to attack the deal. But I definitely think you have seen this very discreet, extremely well-funded campaign to try to derail the negotiation and try to derail the deal. And, there's this Time article that came out yesterday. A friend sent it to me. It's worth reading because it lists a bunch of people who have quite literally been paid by a former Trump campaign person who was himself paid by certain elements within the Israeli government. Foreign governments try to influence the United States all the time. Israel does it. Other countries do it. It's just sort of the nature of the beast. What bothers me is actually when Americans meaning American leadership, allows that influence to affect their judgment and to affect what they are advocating for.
Now, while Vance's recounting of this statement of fact and his comments about Israel's influence in the United States and its attempted influence operations prompted really harsh responses, you don't even need to listen to J.D. Vance or Time Magazine or some blogger like me to talk about how Israel is trying to run an influence operation targeting the right wing in the United States. You can just take Benjamin Netanyahu's word for it.
And what we have to do is we have to secure that part of the base of our support in the United States. That is being challenged systematically. A lot of this is done with money. Money of NGOs, vast. Money of governments, vaster. Okay? We have to fight back. How do we fight back? Our influencers. I think you should also talk to them if you have a chance. To that community, they're very important. And secondly, we're going to have to use the tools of battle. You know, the weapons change over time. You can't fight today with swords. That doesn't work very well. Okay, and you can't fight with cavalry. That doesn't work very well. And you have these new things, you know, like drones, things like that. I won't get into that. But we have to fight with the weapons that apply to the battlefields in which we're engaged. And the most important ones are in social media.
Now, that's from last year. So in a pair of interviews with India's NewsX and Pakistan's English language public broadcaster, I spoke a little bit about what is up with Iran and the war and the prospects for peace. I also spoke about the U.S. political scene, about the whole controversy about Israel in the upcoming elections, in the midterms. Just remember, we're just 109 days away from those midterm elections, and that's going to have a potentially huge impact on the United States as well as the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Here's the NewsX World interview.
Now, as you know, the civilian death toll is rising. Are you hearing any reports of the conditions within Iran? Is it the same as during May, April, and March when we also saw Iran cutting off internet for many people? Is the internet connection in Iran the same now, or they have connection?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's actually continuing. The internet connectivity has continued. It has not been cut off this time. I think primarily because the regime is feeling confident. They cut off internet last time because they were afraid of internal domestic protests against the regime. I think that after the recent outpouring of support for the regime during the funeral services for the former Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, they are not as fearful of their own people right now. And I think that there is a little bit more confidence in the people. But I also think that in general, things are just not as bad as they were. And the X factor in this conflict is the Israelis. As bad as the Americans can be sometimes with targeting civilians inadvertently, they are a little bit more careful, a little bit more concerned about their international image and so on. And so I don't think that, and I say this as an American citizen myself, I don't think that the U.S. Army has a policy of targeting civilians. They don't do these kinds of vicious targeted assassinations in which sometimes hundreds of innocent civilians are killed. That was what the Israelis were doing. And so I think that the absence of the Israelis has made the war situation a little bit more normal, shall we say, and that things, ordinary life outside of these areas that are being targeted by the Americans along the southern coastline so far has been pretty normal.
And Mr. Dargahi also, among the Iranians in Iran, we used to, before this war started in February, we used to hear there were a lot of Mossad agents, etc., etc. How much of those things, from your analysis, true, who have infiltrated within the Iranian system, who pushed for more calls of the regime change, etc.? Maybe it has been contained by Iranian regime?
Yeah, I think that that's an interesting question as well. I think that, yes, there were certain networks of foreign intelligence services inside Iran. And it's really hard to, when you're talking about clandestine operations, it's really hard to get very accurate information about that kind of stuff. It's by its nature really secret. But to the best of my knowledge and my informed speculation, many of these networks that Israel and the Mossad had set up inside Iran were rolled up and destroyed in the January protests. in those protests that preceded the first war. And so there are many indications that Iran's networks that were built over, Israel's networks rather, that were built over years inside Iran have been damaged significantly during those protests, and that the infiltration has taken a big step back from the time of the January protests until now.
And Mr. Dargahi, to me, it seems like right now Israel is not interested. Maybe they might in the future, who knows? But for now, they are staying away from this time of round of escalation. It's just US and Iran fighting with each other. So do you think Netanyahu has realized the disalignment that came up during the war between US and Israel, and he has decided to stay away per se from this time of round of escalation?
No, I think that all the reporting indicates that the Americans asked Israel to stay out of it, in part because of the nature of their fighting nature, the way they have been fighting, and the kind of no-holds-barred Gaza strategy they tend to employ in these kinds of conflicts. That's not the direction that Americans want to take. And other reporting also indicates that Netanyahu is fine staying out of this for now because they get to see their dream, America fighting Iran, and them not getting attacked, the people of Israel not having to brace for Iranian missiles and hide inside bunkers, and that makes the Israelis rather happy. They've been trying to trigger this war for decades. Now they finally have it. They see America fighting their war against Iran. This is fine with many in the Israeli political scene.
Yes, and Mr. Darga, you also touched on this in your Badlands newsletter as well. I saw it. So Israel emerging as the most beneficiary of this war.
I think it thought it would emerge as the beneficiary of the war, but the way that things turned out, because of the unexpected resilience of the Iranian regime, because of the ability of the Iranian regime to seize the Strait of Hormuz and capture the global attention, it has turned into a setback, especially for certain factions inside Israel. And it looks like Benjamin Netanyahu is not doing so well ahead of the upcoming elections.
And also, Mr. Darga, last but not least, Netanyahu, you mentioned his elections, and he needs to focus on Israel for these elections, right? What about President Trump? He has election coming in 110 days. Where's his attention at?
I mean, it's really curious. It seems like and I heard some reporting and speculation as to this, that basically Trump has decided that, he's never been a real standard bearer for the Republican Party. He almost hijacked the party and took it away from its natural inheritors. And it doesn't seem like he really cares about the fate of the Republican Party even now. I think that his talk earlier this evening about election interference suggests that he might try to make a move against the Democrats ahead of the elections, the midterm elections, or he's just setting up a situation where when the Democrats win in November, he can basically say it was fake. It was a fake election. It was rigged, like he always does whenever he loses an election. So, it could be one of those two things. Either he doesn't care what happens in the midterms and more concerned about securing his legacy by having a decent outcome in the Iran war, or he's just going to, no matter what happens, call the election fake and probably try to ignore Congress come January 1st. Here's the interview with Pakistan's public broadcaster. This is my first with them.
In terms of what's happening at this time, as far as the conflict itself is concerned, we've gone back to the stage as far as uncertainty is concerned. We've gone back to that point where now it seems difficult to predict whether there can be a peace deal between both US and Iran. Is that correct?
I mean, I think eventually there will be some kind of peace deal. It's just a question of, will that take 6 more days, 6 more weeks, 6 more months, or even potentially years? Because this is the kind of conflict that countries stumble into. They don't plan for a long-term war, but that could happen very well. And that could really have an impact on both these countries, the United States and Iran, as well as the region. Now, this is a kind of a harsh situation right now because there's a number of uncertainties, and so much of this conflict and so much of efforts that are an obstacle to ending the conflict have to do with the personality and idiosyncrasies of one man, Donald Trump, who does not seem to operate in the kind of normal diplomatic mode that many of the people in the international community are used to. He seemed very, very obsessed with optics, with how his peace deal or war look on television. This is not a situation that works well. He's prone to boasting and leaking of things that have gone on in the discussions that are not helpful. Even his own negotiators are sometimes frustrated by his actions. And then you have the situation of a regime in Tehran that also breaks a lot of norms and rules.
What are the biggest risks at this point when we look at, of course, consecutive nights of US strikes? And of course, Iranian retaliation, that this may never actually go back to the table?
I think that they will eventually go back to the table, but I think that the biggest risks at this point are massive civilian casualties, potentially, that would embolden and harden the Iranian position. And then the other more obvious risk that is basically imminent is attacks on energy infrastructure in Iran that would prompt attacks on energy infrastructure by the Iranians in the Gulf, and that would be devastating for the whole world. Those are the biggest risks right now.
Do you think that Iran is, there is a cognizance to sort of respond, but also to have it a measured response so that, things don't escalate to a degree where they can't come back from? Do you think that there is that cognizance on both sides?
It's hard to say right now because there have been threats and counter threats, and there's a lot of rhetoric. Iranians have made it clear. They have said that they will respond to the Americans at a 1.5 rate, so that if the American strike is at a level of 10, let's say, the Iranians say they'll strike at a level of 15. That hasn't happened so far. They also seem to reciprocate. For example, strike on an energy facility will lead to another strike on an energy facility in the Gulf countries. And we haven't seen the American strikes on the energy facilities in Iran yet, not in a large scale, but we've seen the airstrikes and attacks creeping up on those energy facilities. And that is the crucial aspect. Donald Trump is also issuing a lot of rhetoric. He is talking about this is going to be the day of the bridges. This is going to be the day of the electricity power plants. He's talking about scaling up the attacks next week. And we don't know that we don't know whether he's being serious or whether he's just issuing his normal bluster. So we have two governments that basically they're used to a lot of bragging. They speak a lot and they bark a lot. And they use a lot of very heated rhetoric in their description of their attacks. But when the attacks come down, they seem to be a little bit more measured on the one hand. And on the other hand, let's be frank, we have no idea what's really happening because of the regimes of censorship that are being imposed by the Gulf countries and by Iran and by the U.S. military on the impact of the various strikes. It's a very unusual situation in that sense.
In terms of lasting damage, when we look at, infrastructure damage, when we look at, a lot of that's happened from what we have available or what information we have available, the cost of Iran going back, because that was something of a concern from point zero, right? The fact that they've already in the middle of so much economic hardship. Even when it ends, whenever that is, it will take a long time for Iran to recover. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think definitely it will take some time for the Iranian infrastructure to be rebuilt, especially when you talk about, for example, steel factories that have been struck, port facilities, electricity and oil facilities. These take not months, but years to build. And that will be tough for the Iranians in the long run once the war ends, whenever that will be. For now, though, I think that you hit upon a key question there, one of resilience. There's a key difference between the United States and much of the world, frankly, and Iran. Iran is not subject to democratic whims. Let's be frank. It's an authoritarian system, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't have domestic politics, but the Iranian leadership can tell its people to sit down and shut up and silence them if there's any kind of criticism of the economy. No real vote, although there are elections in Iran, there's no real vote for the system because the elected part of the government is not very powerful compared to the more permanent part of the government. Whereas in the United States, even a little bit of pain, gas going up to $5 a gallon, so to speak, that would cause a big, huge political crisis. That would cause a government to change, for example. So the resiliency was actually very much in Iran's favor.
When we look at what's happened as far as Israel is concerned. We've seen the comments come from the US Vice President when he says that elements within the Israeli government have been working against a diplomatic outcome. How do you look at this in the light of what has earlier transpired? Of course, the relationship that US has with Israel, but also more recently, what we've seen is more a rap on the knuckles earlier on by the US Vice President. Even now, the comments that he's made so openly, and then the telephone call that was leaked between President Donald Trump and Netanyahu. What does that signal? Are there fissures there which are being openly aired? How do you look at these developments?
Well, I think there's a few things going on. One is that the American public is having a major seismic shift away from Israel and a preference for Israel as a partner, as an ally. More and more people from both sides of the ideological spectrum are coming out as either neutral or outright hostile to Israel. And politicians are being forced to react. It's becoming a kind of litmus issue on the left for Democratic Party candidates to elected office. It's Israel, and whether they're opposed to Israel and how much they're opposed to Israel is actually becoming a litmus test as to whether they are eligible and qualified to run for office on the part of the voters. So I think that many politicians, including J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, they're trying to manage that wave. They're trying to make sure that they are not hurt by that wave. On the other hand, you have a U.S. national security establishment that is wholly integrated in some ways with Israel's. There is major infiltration by Israel inside the American national security establishment on the levels of the military, intelligence, and so on. And they're trying to use their influence to make sure that this change doesn't come about, that this shift doesn't come about, at least on an operational level. On the other hand, you also have someone like J.D. Vance, who is trying to play both sides, appease the Israelis by saying that he is not so obsessed with Israel. On the other hand, giving out critical information and making certain assessments that make him sound more favorable to the crowd that is opposed to Israel. There's a bunch of things going on. And then there is also this major, and it's quite visible, actually, if you just follow social media, major influence campaign backed by Israel, very well documented, in which they're trying to influence American public opinion and flailing in some respects, not able to do so effectively by issuing all sorts of proclamations and having all sorts of email and social media campaigns. The problem for Israel right now is none of that is really working.
Hey, thank you so much for listening or watching to Badlands. I'm Borzu Deragahi. You can find me on Substack at borzu.substack.com. I'm also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on YouTube.